In the spring of 1878, a boarding house keeper in Dodge City, Kansas, stopped a man at her front door. He was not drunk. He was not armed. She stopped him because the smell rolling off his body hit her from 6 feet away, so thick she could taste it on her tongue. He was a buffalo hunter, just in from the southern plains, and the flies had followed him into town. Every cowboy who ever walked across a movie screen did it looking like he had just stepped out of a hot bath. The truth would have knocked you backward before you ever saw his face. One group of men on this frontier carried a stench so overpowering that even hardened plainsmen crossed a muddy street just to stay upwind. By the time we reach number 1, you will know who they were. The question is whether they are the ones you expect. Because Hollywood did not just get the hats wrong, it erased an entire sense. Now, before we go any further, tap that subscribe button. Stay until the end, because the truth gets darker with every step. We are not going to the movies for this. We are going to the diaries. The letters written by firelight and sent home on the next stage. The Army surgeon reports filed at posts from Fort Laramie to Fort Sill. The newspaper columns written by editors who stood in frontier towns and described exactly what hit them when the wind shifted. The real American West was not a painting on a gallery wall. It was a world you would have smelled long before you ever saw it. No running water in any cabin west of St. Louis. No soap as we understand it today. No change of clothes for weeks, sometimes months at a stretch. And bodies layered with smoke, grease, sweat, animal blood, and bare earth every waking day. A man walking the streets of Abilene, Kansas in 1871 carried the product of everything he had done since his last real wash. And his last real wash was probably a cold creek 2 weeks behind him. That was not the worst of it. That was ordinary. That was baseline. And that is where we begin. Number 20. Wood smoke. Every man on the frontier lived inside a permanent cloud of it. Campfires on the open prairie. Hearths in one room, dirt floor cabins where the chimney draw was poor, and smoke hung under the rafters all winter. Cook fires fed with whatever would burn. On the Great Plains, where timber was scarce for hundreds of miles, men fed their fires with buffalo chips, dried dung that threw an acrid, animal-tinted smoke into everything it touched. The smoke soaked into hair and would not come out. It buried itself in wool shirts, in blankets, in the grain of leather boots. It settled into skin like a stain you could not scrub away because you had nothing to scrub with. Travelers arriving from the East in the 1850s described frontier men as smelling like they had been hung in a smokehouse and cured alongside the bacon. And here is the thing that matters. Wood smoke was not the problem on this list. It was the foundation. It was the bottom layer onto which every other smell we are about to count was built, day after day, month after month, until the man and the smoke were the same thing and neither one noticed. Number 19. Chewing tobacco. Nearly every working man on the frontier carried a plug of dark leaf in his cheek or his shirt pocket. The juice-stained beards darkened shirt fronts a permanent brown and left a constant smell of fermented leaf and warm saliva on the face and hands. Mark Twain, riding a stagecoach across the Nevada desert in 1861, described the floor of the coach as slick with tobacco spit from one wall to the other. Spittoons existed in frontier saloons for one reason. The alternative was the floor and the boots of every man standing at the bar. The smell was sweet at first, then sour, then something worse underneath that never quite went away. It lived in a man's beard. It lived in the creases of his mouth. And in close quarters, on a stagecoach bench pressing thigh to thigh across 400 miles, you breathed it whether you wanted to or not. Number 18. Rotting teeth and the breath that came with them. There was no dentistry on the frontier, no toothbrush as we know it. A man might scrub his teeth with a twig or a rag dipped in salt if he was fastidious. Most did not bother. By the age of 30, most frontier men had blackened stumps, exposed roots, and abscesses they lived with until the pain became more than whiskey could drown. The breath of a man with an untreated abscess smells of something spoiling inside a living body. Women on the overland trail wrote letters home describing it inside the close air of a covered wagon. Every cowboy in every Western film smiles with a full set of white teeth. The real teeth behind those frontier lips would have turned your stomach before a single word came out. Number 17. Cooking grease and tallow ground into clothing. Frontier men cooked over open flame in animal fat. Bacon drippings. Rendered tallow. Bear fat when the hunting was good. It splattered onto shirts and trouser legs and was never laundered out because laundry meant hauling water, heating it, and owning soap you could not afford. Over weeks, the fat turned. Clothing became stiff and shiny with layered grease that darkened with each new meal. The smell was thick and close, like standing beside a pan that was left on a dead fire and never scraped. You could read a man's last month of eating on his shirt front. Nobody washed that shirt. Water west of the 100th meridian was for drinking and for keeping the animals alive. It was not for laundry. Number 16. Whiskey sweating through the pores. Heavy drinking on the frontier was not a vice. It was a rhythm. Corn whiskey, rot gut traded at the sutler's store, whatever burned on the way down. When a man drank enough of it over enough days, the alcohol metabolized through his skin. The smell was sharp, sour, and unmistakable, even outdoors with a wind blowing. Post commanders at Western Army forts documented the smell of the barracks the morning after payday, when every soldier had spent his wages on whiskey from the sutler. Temperance writers touring the frontier in the 1850s described whole settlements as smelling like the inside of a barrel. They were not using a figure of speech. They meant it. And the smell of whiskey was not a layer you could wash away. It came from the inside out. Number 15. Unwashed wool and homespun fabric. Cotton was expensive west of the Mississippi. Most working men wore wool or linsey woolsey, a rough blend of linen and wool spun at home. Wool absorbs sweat, body oil, and every smell a man's body produces, and it holds them without letting go. These garments were worn for weeks at a time, sometimes the full stretch between towns. When they were washed at all, it was in cold creek water with no soap, which moved the dirt around but stripped nothing underneath. The smell of a wool shirt after a month of frontier labor in summer was damp, rank, and unmistakably animal. That was the shirt a man called clean, because it was the only one he had. Number 14. Bear grease and animal fat pomade. Men on the frontier slicked their hair back with animal fat. Bear grease was the most common choice west of the Missouri River. It worked well. It held the hair flat, and in warm weather it went rancid within 2 or 3 days. The smell of turning bear fat, sitting in a man's hair just inches from his own face and yours, was a constant fact of life in any room where men gathered. Barbers in frontier towns sometimes stirred in camphor or clove oil trying to cut the smell. The effort was sincere. The result was rancid bear grease that also smelled faintly of camphor. A man sitting across a card table from you with fresh bear grease in his hair was tolerable. A man 3 days past his last application was something else entirely, and most men were 3 days past. Number 13. Foot rot in leather boots. 1 pair of boots. That was what most frontier men owned. No socks. Rags wrapped around the feet served as padding if a man bothered at all. Boots were expensive. A working man wore his pair until the soles cracked and then patched them with rawhide and wore them again. Feet sweated into raw, untreated leather day after day, in baking heat and in freezing cold. Fungal infections were so common, nobody considered them worth mentioning. Army inspection reports from Western posts tell a different story. At Fort Riley, Kansas in the 1860s, the commanding officer ordered men to air their boots outside the barracks walls each night, not because hygiene was expected, because the smell of 200 pairs of rotting boots in an enclosed room was destroying the morale of the entire company. The inspector's report survives. The smell does not. Be grateful. Number 12. The lie of lye soap. This is where a common assumption cracks apart. When frontier men did wash, and most of them did when they had the chance, they used lye soap. Homemade from wood ash leached in water and mixed with rendered animal fat. It was harsh enough to strip skin raw. It burned the eyes and cracked the hands. But here is what it did not do. It did not kill bacteria. It did not eliminate the deep body odor that comes from weeks of living without clean water and clean clothes. It moved the surface grime and left a man smelling of tallow and lye ash instead of sweat. That was clean by the standard of the day. The frontier idea of clean and our idea of clean are not even in the same territory. Hollywood shows a man splashing in a stream and walking out fresh as morning. The truth is, a man walking out smelling slightly different, not better, just different. We are halfway through this list, and we have not yet reached the men who smelled so bad that other frontier men already carrying every odor I have described so far, could not tolerate them in the same room. Remember the question I asked at the start. We are getting closer, and it gets worse from here. Number 11. Body lice. Not occasional, not a mark of shame, expected, universal. As common on the frontier as dust on a boot. Body lice lived in the seams of clothing, laid their eggs in the stitching, and fed on the skin underneath. A heavy infestation produces its own distinct smell. Warm, biological, wrong. Something your nose flags before your mind catches up. Army medical records from Western posts in the 1860s and 70s document infestation rates that would stagger a modern reader. Not 10% of the men, not half. Nearly all of them, in some garrisons, at some times of year. The treatments were worse. Mercury ointment rubbed directly into the skin. Kerosene poured along the seams of a shirt while a man was still wearing it. Sulfur powder dusted into every fold of clothing, turning a man yellow and chemical at the same time. Some men burned their infested clothes and started over. Most could not afford to lose the only shirt on their back. So they lived with the lice, and the lice lived with them. Number 10. Horse. Not the smell of a stable you drive past on a country road. The smell of a man and a horse becoming one creature over weeks and months. A working man on the frontier spent more hours beside his horse than beside any human being alive. Saddle leather, horse sweat, manure, the warm animal musk that rises off a working horse in summer, all of it pressed into wool and cotton and skin until a man carried it everywhere he went. Cowboys, freight drivers, cavalry troopers. It did not matter. The smell of horse was not on them, it was in them. Old livery stable keepers in trail towns claimed they could identify the breed of horse a stranger rode just from the smell on his coat sleeve. The frontier cowboy and his horse were not partners. They were the same animal wearing different skin. Number 9. Sulfur water. Across wide stretches of the American West, the only water a man could find tasted and smelled of sulfur. The sharp, rotten egg stink rising from springs, seeps, and shallow wells dug in alkaline soil. Men drank it because there was nothing else within a day's ride. They cooked their beans and coffee in it. They washed their faces in it on the rare occasions they washed at all. And the sulfur clung. It clung to skin, to clothing, to breath, to hair. In parts of West Texas, in the Dakota Badlands, and in the mineral country of the Rockies, travelers on the emigrant trails wrote home that you could smell a settlement on the wind before the buildings came into view. The water that was supposed to make a man cleaner only added a new layer to everything he already carried. You drank what the ground offered you and wore the proof on your body for days. Number 8. Infected wounds and frontier medicine. A cut that went bad on the frontier did not get better on its own. Without antiseptic, without antibiotics, without even the germ theory that most doctors back east were still arguing about, infections set in fast and held. The smell of a wound going septic is sweet, heavy, and unmistakable. It fills a room. It follows a man down a street. Frontier remedies piled new smells on top. Turpentine poured directly into open flesh. Coal oil. Bread poultices left on too long and gone sour. In remote settlements, a poultice of animal dung pressed against a wound was considered sound frontier medicine. A man being treated smelled of rot and cure at the same time. And the men around him, in the same cabin, sleeping on the same floor, had no door to close against it. Number 7. The Trail Drive Cowboy. Here is the man Hollywood loved most. The tall rider, the wide hat, the dust on the trail behind him. And here is the truth that genre will never put on film. A cattle drive from South Texas to the railheads in Kansas took 2 to 3 months across open country. 8 to 10 men. 2,000 head of longhorn cattle. A cowboy slept in the clothes he rode in. He ate dust from the herd all day long, fine gritty powder mixed with dried manure, and it coated his face and filled every crease of his neck. He sweated through every shirt he carried, dried out in the saddle, and sweated through them again. His only bath was a rare river crossing in water the herd had fouled upstream. By the time a trail crew reached Dodge City, they were turned away at the door of most businesses until they visited the bathhouse. Not as a suggestion, as a condition of entry. Newspaper accounts from the 1870s described the arrival of a trail herd as something you smelled on the wind before you heard the cattle. The clean cowboy of the Western film has never existed outside a Hollywood wardrobe department. Number 6. Tanning and hide work. Turning raw animal skin into usable leather required some of the foulest chemistry the frontier had to offer. Fresh hides were soaked in open vats of urine, lime, and standing water until the hair loosened and the flesh began to soften. Brain tanning, the practice of rubbing the animal's own brain tissue into the hide to make it supple, was used by native peoples and frontier settlers alike. The vats stank. The hides stank. And the men who stood over them hour after hour carried the smell in their skin for days after they walked away. In any settled town, the tannery was placed at the far edge of the community, downwind by local agreement. The tanner was a necessary man. He was also a man nobody wanted sitting next to them at the table. Number 5. Mining camp men, the California gold fields of 1849. The Nevada Silver Country, the Colorado mountain camps. Mining men worked underground or stood in freezing streams for 10 or 12 hours a day. They slept in canvas tents with mud floors and had no access to clean water that was not already being used for sluicing ore. Mercury, used to separate gold from crushed rock, coated their hands and worked into their clothing. Stone dust and chemical runoff from the sluice boxes mixed with weeks of unwashed sweat into something no word in the language can touch. Bayard Taylor, the journalist who reported from the California diggings for the New York Tribune in 1849, described camp conditions in language that makes a modern reader pull back from the page. The gold rush was not golden. It smelled like poison, desperation, and men who no longer remembered what clean felt like. Number 4. The mountain man in buckskins. The fur trappers of the 1820s and 1830s lived in animal hide, buckskin trousers, buckskin shirts, buckskin leggings laced to the knee, sometimes worn for an entire trapping season from autumn to spring without once being removed. Buckskin absorbs sweat, dried blood, animal grease, and wood smoke, and it does not let them go. Over months, the leather darkened and stiffened and became a second skin, carrying every smell the man had lived through since the day he pulled it on. At the annual summer rendezvous gatherings, where hundreds of trappers came together at a single meadow to trade and drink, contemporary accounts describe the smell of the camp as overpowering from a quarter-mile away. Rancid animal fat, wood smoke, cured hide, and the accumulated human body of men who saw no reason to wash when there was beaver to trap and whiskey to trade for. The mountain man of the movie poster, square-jawed and clean in golden light, would not survive 10 minutes in the real camp that made him. Number 3. Gangrene on a living man. Here is where this list stops being about discomfort and becomes something harder to carry. Gangrene is the death of living tissue on a body that is still breathing. The flesh blackens, it softens, and it produces a smell that every person who has encountered it describes the same way. The worst thing a human nose can register. On the frontier, without a trained surgeon, without anesthesia, a man with a gangrenous arm or leg carried that smell for days or weeks. He carried it while he waited for someone brave enough to attempt the amputation, or he carried it until his body gave out. Other men in the same cabin had no choice. They slept 3 feet from it, ate beside it, breathed it into their lungs with every intake of air. There was no separate room, no closed door. Army surgeons at Western posts wrote that the canvas of their operating tents became permanently saturated. No amount of airing removed it. Civil War surgeons who later served at frontier installations said the smell followed them home in the wool of their uniforms. It did not fade, and the men who kept working and sleeping in those quarters carried it in their nostrils long after the patient was gone. 2 entries remain, and the worst smell the American frontier ever produced is still ahead of us. The men who carried it were not soldiers, not trappers, not miners. They were something the open plains created and the open plains consumed. And even the hardest, most trail-worn, most leather-skinned men in the American West would not sit downwind of them in a saloon. Remember the question I asked you at the very beginning. We are about to answer it. Number 2. The Army Post in summer. A Western military post was every smell on this list gathered into one fenced compound and heated by the July sun. Hundreds of men in close wooden barracks. Open latrine trenches dug yards from the sleeping quarters. Horse corrals and mule pens close enough to hear every stamp and smells every pile. Meat stores hanging without refrigeration, turning in the heat. Surgical waste buried in shallow pits. And every single man on that post carrying his own full accumulation of wood smoke, sweat, tobacco, rancid grease, lice, and whiskey. Post surgeon reports from Fort Laramie, Fort Sill, and installations across the southern plains describe the summer smell in language that leaves nothing to the imagination. Officers arriving fresh from the east turned pale before they reached the gate. The Army knew the problem. The surgeons put it in their official reports and filed them with the War Department in Washington. And nothing changed because there was nowhere else to station the men and nowhere else to put what they carried. Number 1. The Buffalo Hunter. This is it. The single worst smell the American frontier ever produced was not a disease. It was not a wound. It was a profession. The commercial buffalo hunter of the 1870s killed, skinned, and stacked hides for weeks at a stretch on the open southern plains of Kansas, Texas, and Indian Territory. A good hunter killed 40 to 60 buffalo a day. His skinners worked behind him, stripping the hides and leaving the carcasses to rot where they fell. The hunter slept in the same clothes he worked in, clothes stiffened with dried blood until they cracked at the joints when he moved. He knelt in pools of buffalo blood and offal for hours every working day. Dried blood layered on his hands and forearms like a dark glove that flaked and rebuilt with each new kill. Rotting fragments of flesh and fat clung to his boots, his leggings, and the seams of every garment he wore. The hides he stacked on his wagon were treated with arsenic powder to keep the beetles and blowflies from devouring them before they reached the buyer, and the arsenic soaked through his own clothing and into his skin, along with the blood and the grease and the rot. The flies followed him everywhere. They swarmed his wagon and his horse and his hat. They were part of the outfit. Now put that man in a room. A buffalo hunter arriving in Dodge City after 6 weeks on the range walked through the door of a Front Street saloon, and the room emptied around him. Not one customer leaving. Not two. The room. And these were not delicate men. These were trail drive cowboys who had not bathed in 3 months. Soldiers from Fort Dodge carrying the full smell of the barracks. Gamblers, freighters, drifters, plainsmen who wore every odor on this entire list as their daily companion. And they could not remain in the same room as the buffalo hunter. Robert Wright, who ran a trading post in Dodge City and later wrote about those years, described it plainly. The hunters were served, but separately, kept apart from the other customers. Newspaper accounts from the Kansas railhead towns describe buffalo hunters being refused beds at boarding houses, refused plates at restaurants, and refused seats at poker tables. Not for any crime, not for any threat, for the smell alone. Old-timers in Dodge claimed the odor soaked into the wooden walls and plank floors of buildings the hunters entered and lingered there for days after they had ridden back out onto the open plains. This was the man the frontier created at its most extreme, and he is the man no Western film has ever once put on screen. So the question I planted at the start has its answer. The buffalo hunter earned number 1. But now we stop counting and look at what this entire list is actually telling us. Because the ranking is not the real story. The real story is what was happening on every frontier man's body, every single day, whether he hunted buffalo or not. Modern chemistry can explain it. Human sweat left to accumulate for days without washing breeds entire colonies of bacteria. Those bacteria produce compounds, acids, and sulfur molecules that our noses register as deeply foul. That is just the sweat. Now layer on rancid animal fat from cooking and pomade. Wood smoke residue ground into every fiber of clothing. Mercury and arsenic absorbed through the skin from mining and hide treatment. Decaying organic matter from animal blood, offal, and scraps pressed into boot leather and trouser seams. You arrive at a chemical combination that would overwhelm a modern person in seconds flat. Researchers who study historical hygiene estimate that a frontier man's body odor after 3 weeks without washing would register at a level most people alive today have never encountered and could not tolerate. But here is the part that changes everything we think we know about the frontier. The human nose adapts. When a smell is constant enough for long enough, the brain simply stops registering it. Doctors call it olfactory fatigue. And it is the single reason nobody on the American frontier ever sat down and wrote a letter home saying we all smell terrible out here. They did not know. They could not know. They were living inside the smell. They were the smell. Every man around them carried the same cloud. There was no contrast, no clean baseline to measure against. The rare moments when the truth broke through were when someone new arrived. A recently landed immigrant family from the East, a woman stepping off a stagecoach from St. Louis into a Kansas trail town for the first time. Those people recoiled. And their accounts survive in the diaries. They are honest and vivid, and they describe a sensory world we can no longer reconstruct, because we have never once been that far from a bar of soap. 3 hands built the LIE we all grew up watching. The first belonged to Owen Wister, a Philadelphia gentleman who visited Wyoming and went home to write a novel. His 1892 book, The Virginian, gave this country its first romantic cowboy hero. Handsome, quiet, tall in the saddle, and, without ever saying a word about it, impossibly clean. Wister had been to the frontier. He knew what those men smelled like. He chose not to write it. The dime novelists followed him by the hundreds, printing thousands of penny adventure stories about men who drew fast and rode hard and never once sweated through their hats. Ned Buntline, Prentice Ingraham, the whole industry of frontier fiction. Not a single one of those writers described the smell of the heroes they invented. Not one line, not one word. The frontier man of popular fiction was born clean and stayed that way. Then came Hollywood. And Hollywood finished the job. John Ford filming cowboys riding through Monument Valley in pressed cotton shirts without a single stain. John Wayne swinging down from a horse looking like wardrobe had dressed him 5 minutes before the camera rolled. Clint Eastwood wearing the same poncho across a desert for an entire film and somehow coming out the other side spotless. Gary Cooper standing in the noon sun at high noon looking like he had just come from the barber. The entire Western genre, every studio, every decade from the 1930s through the 1970s built a visual language in which frontier men were dusty but never dirty, weathered but never foul, rugged but never revolting. They did not just simplify the story or leave out a detail. They erased the single most constant, most universal, most inescapable fact of daily life on the American frontier. The smell of the men who actually lived it. Here is my honest read. The buffalo hunter stands at number 1, and he earned every inch of it. But the deeper truth is not a ranking. Every man on this list, the cowboy, the trapper, the miner, the soldier, the tanner, the ordinary farmer breaking sod on a Kansas quarter section, was carrying his own version of all 20 entries on his body at the same time. The buffalo hunter was not a separate creature. He was the ordinary frontier man with the volume turned all the way up. The distance between number 20 and number 1 was not a difference in kind. It was degree. And every single man in between was somewhere on that same line, carrying the same smoke, the same grease, the same sweat, the same animal, the same slow accumulation of a life lived without the luxury of being clean. Today, the average American showers once a day, owns more sets of clothing than a frontier man saw in a whole lifetime, spends money on soap and shampoo and deodorant without a second thought. We live in a world where a stranger's body odor on a crowded subway car makes the local evening news, and the offended writers post about it online within the hour. That is the distance. That is how far we have come from the people who broke the ground we built our houses on. Your great-great-grandfather, if he lived west of the Missouri River before 1900, carried some version of this list on his body every day he drew breath. He built the fences, he broke the sod, he drove the cattle, he dug the ore, he fought the fights and buried the dead, and walked home carrying the smell of all of it on his back. And not one person in Hollywood ever put that man on screen the way he actually was. They gave the clean version a poster and a theme song. They left the real man standing in the street, turned away at the boarding house door, with no one alive to tell you what it cost him to be there. The frontier never handed its dignity to the men who earned it. It made them carry everything, including the smell, and then it forgot their names. Which one hit you the hardest? Tell me below. And if you want the truth behind another part of frontier life the movies scrubbed clean, the next one is already waiting for you.